In the winter of 1933, the United States was on the edge of collapse. The Great Depression had reached its darkest depths. More than 25% of Americans were unemployed. Banks were failing by the thousands. Millions of families had lost their homes and life savings. Bread lines stretched for blocks in every major city. Factories stood silent. Farmers burned crops they could not sell while people starved. Into this national nightmare stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On March 4, 1933, he was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he promised bold action. Within days, he began implementing the New Deal, an aggressive series of economic reforms designed to rescue the country from total ruin. He closed the banks, created new regulatory agencies, and pushed through sweeping legislation that challenged the unchecked power of big business and Wall Street. To millions of desperate Americans, Roosevelt was a savior. To a small but extremely powerful group of bankers and industrialists, he was something else entirely. They saw him as a dangerous radical. They feared his policies, especially banking regulations, labor rights, and wealth redistribution measures, would destroy their fortunes and turn America towards socialism. In private meetings in boardrooms across New York and Philadelphia, these men began to speak openly about the need for strong leadership of a different kind. Some admired the rising fascist movements in Europe. They believed America needed a similar strong hand to restore order and protect capital. This was the environment in which the business plot was born. A cabal of some of the wealthiest and most influential men in America, executives from J.P. Morgan, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel, Goodyear, Remington Arms, and other major corporations, began exploring ways to remove Roosevelt from power. They did not want to wait for the next election. They wanted a coup. Their plan was audacious: recruit a respected military hero to lead a veterans army, march on Washington, and install a new government that would be friendly to big business and hostile to the New Deal. They believed they could do it with relatively little resistance. To the average American struggling to feed their family in 1933, none of this was visible. They saw a president fighting for recovery. They had no idea that behind closed doors, a group of billionaires was seriously discussing the overthrow of the United States government. The stage was now set for one of the most shocking conspiracies in American history, a plot financed by some of the richest men alive, and one that would ultimately depend on the integrity of a single Marine general. The men who plotted against Franklin D. Roosevelt were not fringe radicals or failed businessmen. They were some of the most powerful and wealthy figures in America. At the center of the conspiracy were executives and heirs from the country's largest corporations and banks. The DuPont family, particularly Irénée DuPont and his brothers, were among the most active. Their company had grown enormously from war profiteering and chemical manufacturing. They saw Roosevelt's labor policies and proposed taxes on the wealthy as an existential threat. Another key figure was Grayson M.P. Murphy, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co., one of the most powerful banks in the world. Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, was also deeply involved, reportedly pledging significant funding. These men operated through a network of private meetings, gentlemen's clubs, and discreet luncheons in New York and Philadelphia. They were united by one overriding fear: that Roosevelt's New Deal would destroy American capitalism as they knew it. They spoke openly about the need for a man on a white horse, a strong military leader who could restore order and protect their interests. To give their movement a respectable public face, they helped create and fund the American Liberty League in 1934. Officially, it was presented as a nonpartisan organization defending the Constitution and free enterprise. In reality, it served as a political vehicle for wealthy industrialists opposed to the New Deal. However, the inner circle wanted more than speeches and lobbying. They wanted regime change. The plotters understood they could not simply buy politicians or wait for elections. Roosevelt was enormously popular with the suffering masses. They needed military muscle, and for that they turned to one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, Major General Smedley Butler. Butler was a legend. At 52 years old, he had served 33 years in the Marine Corps, earned 2 Medals of Honor, and become famous for his blunt honesty. He had fought in wars across the world and later began criticizing how those wars had mostly benefited American corporations. The plotters believed they could appeal to his patriotism and frustration with Washington. In the summer of 1933, a bond salesman named Gerald McGuire, acting as an intermediary for the wealthy backers, began making contact with Butler. What started as casual conversations would soon evolve into a concrete offer of leadership in an armed coup. To the American public, these men were pillars of industry, job creators, and pillars of stability. Behind closed doors, some of them were preparing to abandon democracy itself if it no longer served their financial empire. The machine of the business plot was now in motion. All it needed was the right general to lead it. In the summer of 1933, the conspirators found the man they believed could lead their coup. His name was Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, one of the most respected and decorated Marines in American history. At 52 years old, Butler had spent 33 years in the Corps. He had fought in the Philippines, China, Central America, the Caribbean, and France during World War I. He had been awarded 2 Congressional Medals of Honor. Soldiers called him Old Gimlet Eye and the Fighting Quaker. He was blunt, charismatic, and enormously popular with enlisted men and veterans. The plotters saw Butler as the perfect figurehead, a war hero with genuine credibility among the hundreds of thousands of disillusioned World War I veterans who were suffering during the Depression. Many of these veterans had already marched on Washington in 1932 demanding early bonus payments. The conspirators believed Butler could rally them into a private army. The recruitment began through Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman connected to some of Wall Street's most powerful figures. McGuire first approached Butler under the guise of discussing veterans' issues. Over several meetings in 1933 and early 1934, the conversations grew more serious and more dangerous. McGuire told Butler that a group of America's most influential businessmen were deeply concerned about Roosevelt's direction. He claimed they had raised a war chest of $3 million, roughly $70 million in today's money, and could raise much more. Their plan was audacious. Butler would deliver a speech to the American Legion Convention, calling for the creation of a new veterans organization. This group would then march on Washington with up to 500,000 armed veterans, surround the White House, and force Roosevelt to resign or accept a new Secretary of General Affairs, essentially a dictator who would run the country while Roosevelt remained a ceremonial figure. McGuire was explicit. He told Butler they wanted a Mussolini-style solution for America. He even mentioned that the DuPonts and other industrialists were fully behind the plan, and that Remington Arms would supply the weapons. Butler listened carefully. He asked questions. He played along just enough to gather details. But inside, the decorated general was horrified. He had spent his entire adult life fighting for the United States. Now some of the richest men in the country were asking him to become an American Mussolini and overthrow the elected government. What the plotters did not understand was that Smedley Butler had undergone a profound change in the later part of his career. He had begun to see America's military interventions abroad as gangster capitalism, wars fought primarily to protect corporate profits. In 1935, he would publish the famous book, War is a Racket. He was no longer the unquestioning soldier the plotters believed they had recruited. Instead of accepting their offer, Butler made a fateful decision. He would expose the entire conspiracy. The coup plan the plotters presented to General Butler was remarkably detailed and coldly pragmatic. According to Butler's later sworn testimony, Gerald McGuire laid out the strategy in several meetings between July 1933 and February 1934. The plan had several phases. Phase 1, build a veterans army. Butler would use his immense popularity among veterans to organize and lead a massive new paramilitary group. The plotters claimed they could recruit up to 500,000 men, primarily from the American Legion and the bonus army veterans who were angry and desperate. These men would be armed and organized into a disciplined force. Remington Arms and DuPont were prepared to supply weapons. Phase 2, the March on Washington. Once the army was assembled, Butler would lead it to Washington, D.C. They would surround the White House and Capitol. Under threat of armed force, they would demand that President Roosevelt appoint a new Secretary of General Affairs, essentially a dictator who would take real power while Roosevelt remained as a figurehead president. Phase 3, install a fascist-style government. The new government would suspend parts of the Constitution, crush labor unions, roll back New Deal reforms, and protect corporate interests. The plotters admired Mussolini's Italy and believed a similar strongman system was needed in America to restore order and safeguard capital. McGuire was explicit about financing. He told Butler that the backers had already raised $3 million in cash, with promises of much more. He mentioned specific names and organizations: the DuPont family, J.P. Morgan Interests, Bethlehem Steel, and the American Liberty League. McGuire even showed Butler a telegram from the plotters confirming support. The plan was not vague. It was presented as a serious funded operation. McGuire told Butler he would be the American Mussolini, the public face and military leader of the new regime. To most Americans in 1934, such a plot would have sounded like pure fantasy. The idea that some of the richest men in the country would attempt to overthrow the president by force seemed impossible in the United States. But Butler understood these men had the money, the influence, and the desperation to try. He continued to meet with McGuire and extract more details, all while making a crucial decision in private. Smedley Butler would not become their general. Instead, he would become their undoing. Butler made his decision in early 1934. After months of meetings and increasingly explicit offers, General Smedley Butler realized he was not being asked to lead a patriotic movement. He was being recruited to become the military leader of a fascist coup against the elected government of the United States. Instead of accepting the offer, Butler did something the plotters never expected. He went to the authorities. In March 1934, Butler contacted Pennsylvania Representative Thomas McCormack and New York Representative Samuel Dickstein, who were forming a special committee to investigate un-American activities. On November 20, 1934, Butler testified in secret before the McCormack-Dickstein Committee. He laid out the entire plot in sworn testimony, the names he had been given, the financial offers, the planned size of the veterans' army, and the goal of installing a dictator. The committee was stunned. Butler repeated his testimony publicly a few days later. His account was detailed, consistent, and delivered with the blunt authority of a man who had spent his life in uniform. He named Gerald McGuire as the primary contact. He described the $3 million offer and the promise of unlimited funding from America's wealthiest families. He made it clear that the goal was the violent overthrow of President Roosevelt. The media reaction was immediate and explosive. Major newspapers ran headlines about a fascist plot against the president. For a brief moment, the conspiracy was front-page news across the country. However, the response from the men accused was swift and predictable. Gerald McGuire denied everything. The powerful industrialists and bankers named in connection with the plot issued strong denials, calling Butler either delusional or a publicity seeker. Some suggested he was mentally unstable. Very few of the top-tier backers were ever directly subpoenaed or seriously questioned. Despite the denials, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee took Butler's testimony seriously. In its final report released in February 1935, the committee stated, "There is evidence that certain persons made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." The committee confirmed that a plot had indeed existed. Yet remarkably, no one was arrested. No major prosecutions followed. The wealthy backers were largely shielded from serious consequences. The story faded from the headlines within weeks, buried under other Depression-era news. Smedley Butler had done what he believed was his duty as a Marine and as an American. He had exposed a conspiracy by some of the most powerful men in the country to overthrow democracy, but the system he served ultimately protected the conspirators. The business plot had been stopped, not by law enforcement or the justice system, but by the moral courage of one general who refused to betray his country. The congressional investigation into the business plot was as revealing as it was disappointing. In November 1934, the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, convened in secret to hear General Smedley Butler's testimony. Butler appeared without a lawyer and delivered a detailed, methodical account of everything he had been offered. The $3 million war chest, the promise of unlimited additional funding, the plan to recruit 500,000 veterans, the intended march on Washington, and the ultimate goal of installing a dictator to replace Roosevelt's authority. Butler named names. He identified Gerald McGuire as the main intermediary. He described meetings in hotel rooms and private clubs. He repeated McGuire's references to powerful backers from the DuPont family, J.P. Morgan Interests, Bethlehem Steel, and other major corporations. His testimony was calm, precise, and carried the weight of a man who had spent decades in combat and had nothing left to prove. The committee was shocked by what they heard. After further investigation, they called McGuire to testify. He denied the most serious allegations but stumbled under questioning. His story changed multiple times. The committee also gathered corroborating evidence, telegrams, bank records, and witness statements that supported key parts of Butler's account. On February 15, 1935, the committee released its final public report. In unusually strong language for a congressional document, it concluded, "There is evidence that certain persons made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." The committee confirmed that a serious plot had existed. They acknowledged that powerful financial interests had approached a decorated general to lead an armed movement against the president. It was a stunning validation of Butler's claims. Yet despite this official confirmation, the consequences were almost non-existent. No major prosecutions were pursued. None of the wealthy backers were indicted. Gerald McGuire died suddenly of pneumonia in 1935 before he could face further scrutiny. The story, which had briefly dominated headlines, was allowed to quietly fade from public attention. The Great Depression, the New Deal, and rising international tensions soon pushed the business plot into the background of history. Many historians and journalists at the time noted the disturbing lack of follow-up. It appeared that while a coup plot by some of America's richest men had been exposed, the political and economic power structure was unwilling or unable to hold those men fully accountable. Smedley Butler had done his part. He had blown the whistle on one of the most dangerous conspiracies in American history, but the system he tried to protect ultimately shielded the conspirators. The business plot had failed, yet the men behind it walked away largely untouched. The congressional committee had confirmed the plot was real, yet almost no one was held accountable. The final report of the McCormack-Dickstein Committee in February 1935 was clear and unambiguous. It stated that a serious attempt had been made by wealthy industrialists and financiers to recruit General Butler to lead a fascist-style coup against the United States government. The committee had verified key elements of Butler's testimony. Large sums of money had been discussed, weapons suppliers had been approached, and prominent names from America's corporate elite were connected to the scheme. And then, almost nothing happened. There were no dramatic arrests, no high-profile trials, no major Wall Street executives were dragged before Congress for further questioning. Gerald McGuire, the primary intermediary, died of pneumonia shortly after his testimony, conveniently removing one of the few links that could have been pressured for more names. The DuPont brothers, the J.P. Morgan partners, and the other powerful figures named in connection with the plot issued blanket denials and largely escaped scrutiny. The lack of prosecution shocked many observers at the time. Some journalists openly questioned whether the committee had been pressured to limit the investigation. Others suggested that the political and economic establishment simply did not want to confront the uncomfortable truth, that some of the most respected captains of American industry had been willing to abandon democracy when it no longer served their financial interests. Smedley Butler, for his part, was largely vindicated by the committee's report. However, he was also quietly marginalized. The mainstream press, influenced by the same powerful circles, often portrayed him as a crank or a glory seeker rather than a patriot who had exposed a grave threat. Butler continued to speak out for the rest of his life, warning about the dangers of war, profiteering, and concentrated wealth. He died in 1940, largely forgotten by the public he had tried to protect. The business plot faded into relative obscurity for decades. It was occasionally mentioned in history books as a strange footnote of the Depression era, a half-baked conspiracy that never got off the ground. Only in recent years, with greater access to archives and a more skeptical view of elite power, has the plot received renewed attention as one of the most serious internal threats to American democracy in the 20th century. The final outcome was as revealing as the plot itself. When the wealthiest and most powerful men in America were caught attempting to overthrow the government, the system they helped build protected them. The business plot did not succeed, but its exposure revealed something far more dangerous than the conspiracy itself. In the end, democracy survived not because the system worked, but because one man, General Smedley Butler, refused to sell it out. The coup was stopped before it could begin. Franklin D. Roosevelt remained in power and continued his New Deal. The American Liberty League faded into irrelevance. The men who dreamed of an American Mussolini returned to their boardrooms and country clubs. Yet the final chapter was deeply unsatisfying. What really happened? In 1933 to 1934, some of America's wealthiest bankers and industrialists, from the DuPont, Morgan, and Remington empires, attempted to recruit a decorated Marine general to lead a military coup against President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They offered millions of dollars and promised an army of 500,000 veterans to overthrow the elected government and install a dictator-friendly regime that would protect corporate power from the New Deal. What was the public told at the time? Most Americans were told it was either a ridiculous rumor or the delusions of a publicity-seeking general. The mainstream press quickly downplayed the story, and the names of the powerful backers were largely shielded from serious scrutiny. What evidence contradicted the official narrative? General Butler's detailed sworn testimony, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee's official report confirming the plot was real, corroborating documents, and McGuire's own inconsistent statements. The committee concluded that the conspiracy had been seriously planned and funded. What mechanisms allowed the truth to stay hidden? The immense political and economic power of the accused, media self-censorship, the committee's limited authority, and the national desire to maintain stability during the Depression. No serious prosecutions were pursued. The system protected its wealthiest members. What should we learn from this case today? The business plot remains one of the clearest warnings in American history about how fragile democracy can become when concentrated wealth feels threatened. It showed that even in the United States, some of the most powerful men were willing to abandon the Constitution and embrace authoritarianism if it meant preserving their fortunes. The plot failed not because the institutions were strong, but because one general possessed rare moral courage. Had Butler accepted their offer, American history might have taken a radically different and darker path. Today, as wealth inequality reaches levels not seen since the 1930s and powerful interests once again exert enormous influence over politics and information, the business plot is not ancient history, it is a recurring pattern. When elite power believes the democratic process no longer serves its interests, the temptation to subvert it never fully disappears. Smedley Butler exposed the plot. The committee confirmed it. But America never truly confronted it. And that may be the most disturbing part of all.